This really happened to me. And even now, when I think back, I can still smell the coffee in that courtroom and feel the cold wooden bench under me as I told the truth. The first time I realized my own children had betrayed me, it was at the long oak dining table in my own house. My son had taken the head seat, his wife smirking beside him, and my signature had been forged on a deed that stripped me of everything I worked for my entire life. They laughed while I sat there stunned, realizing they had sold my land, stolen my savings, and left me humiliated in front of neighbors I once fed from my own garden. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, back when the streets still carried the echo of horses, hooves, and the smell of pecan pie cooling on windowsills carried from one block to the next. Ours was the kind of neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, where folks stopped by unannounced just to sit on your porch and gossip about the week's happenings. Reputation meant everything back then. A man's word was his bond, and a woman's respectability could carry her further than money ever could. My grandmother Maybelle was the kind of woman who could silence a room with just one look. She lived through segregation, through poverty, through storms that tore roofs off houses, and still she carried herself with pride. She used to tell me, "Ellie, land is the only thing they ain't making more of. Hold on to it, child. Hold it with both hands, and don't let nobody trick it out of you." I didn't understand back then, but those words grew louder as I got older. By the time I was in my 50s, I had something worth being proud of. 3 rental homes, a modest farmhouse with whitewashed walls, and a reputation as someone who always helped neighbors in trouble. I wasn't wealthy in the flashy sense, but for someone who grew up on cornbread and hand-me-downs, I had carved out a life of stability. Folks trusted me. They came to me for advice on everything from planting tomatoes to how to deal with a landlord who raised rent unfairly. James, my husband, had been the backbone of it all. We married young back when I was just 19, and everyone whispered I was a fool for hitching myself to a mechanic with grease under his nails and no savings to his name. But James was more than grease-stained hands. She was steady, dependable, and he believed in building something lasting. He'd work at the garage all day, then come home and hammer nails into the framework of what became our first rental house. Brick by brick, beam by beam, he built us a life. We didn't vacation in Paris, didn't wear fine clothes, but we had something more valuable: roots. The land we owned was more than soil. It was history. My grandmother's sweat, my husband's calloused hands, my own long nights of bookkeeping by kerosene lamp all of it was stitched into every acre, and my children. Lord, I thought they were my pride. Charles, my eldest, had always been the charming one. From the time he could walk, he had a smile that could melt butter. Teachers loved him, neighbors spoiled him, and when he grew older, women lined up to catch his eye. But charm is a dangerous thing when it isn't grounded in humility. Charles learned early that he could talk his way out of anything, and he carried that arrogance like a badge of honor. Then came Miriam, my only daughter. She was my baby girl, the one who used to braid my hair when my arthritis flared up, the one who cried at sad movies and sang gospel songs with a voice that could bring tears to your eyes. She had sweetness, but it was the kind that could sour quick if she didn't get her way. And Daniel, my youngest, quiet, thoughtful, always with his nose in a book. He wasn't as ambitious as Charles or as persuasive as Miriam, but he had a softness to him that made me believe he'd be the one to care for me in my old age. I raised them on home-cooked meals and discipline. I taught them the same values my grandmother had drilled into me: work hard, speak the truth, and respect family. I thought I'd done right by them, but somewhere along the line, greed carved a hole into their hearts that I didn't see until it was too late. It began quietly, like most betrayals do. Charles started bringing his wife Lydia around more often than usual. Lydia was sharp-tongued with manicured nails that tapped against her phone as if she were too important to be present in the room. She had eyes that scanned everything: my lace curtains, my worn rocking chairs, the cracked tiles in the kitchen with thinly veiled disdain. One evening she looked around my living room and said, "You could sell this whole place and live in one of those luxury condos downtown, Mama. Why keep all this old property when you're too tired to take care of it?" Her tone was sweet, but the sweetness was laced with poison. I brushed it off. I told her this land had been in our family for 3 generations, that it wasn't just soil, but memory. Lydia smiled that hollow smile of hers, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. A few weeks later, Miriam came by with papers she claimed were routine estate planning. She said it would make things easier for the future. I trusted her. She was my baby. After all, I didn't read every page. I just signed where she pointed. And that was my mistake. I discovered months later that my signature appeared on more than just estate documents. It was on transfer deeds, bank authorizations, and agreements I had never laid eyes on. The betrayal was so carefully woven into my daily life that by the time I caught on, they had already stripped me bare. The first sign was small. A tenant from one of my rentals called me, her voice apologetic. "Miss Eleanor, I just wanted to double-check. You said to send rent to a new account." Now I frowned, clutching the phone tighter. "A new account? No, honey. I didn't say any such thing. You keep paying, like you always have." But she insisted she had a paper notice signed with my name, instructing tenants to redirect payments. My stomach dropped. I drove to the bank the very next day, cane clicking against the polished floor. The teller, a young woman with pity in her eyes, pulled up my accounts. "Mrs. Johnson," she said gently, "it looks like funds have been rerouted. And your savings." "I'm sorry, but most of it has been withdrawn." Her words rang in my ears like church bells tolling death. My accounts nearly empty. I had worked my entire life, scrimping, saving, building brick by brick, and now I was left with scraps. I left the bank in a daze, clutching the papers she gave me. When I got home, I sat at the dining table staring at the numbers, the transactions, the forged signature that mocked me, my own name stolen right out from under me. The final blow came that Sunday evening. Charles invited me to dinner at my own house. I walked into the dining room to find him sitting at the head of the table, my chair, his legs spread wide like a king on his throne. Lydia sat beside him, cutting into a steak she hadn't cooked. Smirking, Miriam swirled wine in her glass like it was communion. They looked so smug. Charles cleared his throat and said, "Mama, everything is settled now. The properties are under our names. You don't have to worry anymore." I stared at him, my hands trembling my throat, dry as dust. "You mean you took everything?" Charles leaned back smug and said, "We didn't take it. You gave it to us. It's all legal." Miriam nodded, her face full of false sympathy. "It's for your own good. Mama, you don't need the stress at your age." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip that table and let the plates crash to the floor. But all I did was sit there in silence, my dignity burning away as they laughed. When I stood to leave, Lydia smirked and said, "You'll thank us one day I didn't sleep that night." I sat in my rocking chair staring out the window into the dark, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of a train. My mind ran circles. I thought about my grandmother Maybelle, who had fought tooth and nail to keep her land when others tried to swindle her. I thought about James, who had built our first rental property with his bare hands, and I thought about how my own flesh and blood had reduced me to nothing in my own house. Humiliation burned hot in my chest, but beneath it something else started to stir. I wasn't dead yet. The next morning I marched back to the bank, cane in one hand, determination in the other. This time I demanded copies of every document with my name on it. The clerk hesitated, glanced at me nervously, then quietly slid a thick folder across the desk. I flipped through the pages, right there my stomach twisting tighter with each sheet. There was my name written in shaky pen strokes that mimicked mine but weren't mine. There were notarizations with dates that didn't match my memory, and one name leapt off the page. Lydia's cousin Fraud. I pressed my lips together, the humiliation giving way to suspicion. I started digging quietly, carefully like a woman who knows snakes are coiled under her floorboards. I went to the courthouse archives, asked questions at the tax office, spoke to tenants who had lived in my properties for years. I flipped through dusty files, cross-referenced old contracts, traced every dotted line. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. This hadn't been a sudden betrayal. They had been planning this for years, redirecting checks, creating false authorizations, positioning themselves like vultures circling prey. But I had no proof anyone would take seriously. To the world, I was just an old woman who had signed things without paying attention. My children looked powerful, united, respectable, and I was the one sitting in the back pew at church, whispers tickling the air. Poor Miss Eleanor, she's lost her mind. Thank God her kids are taking care of her. The villains looked untouchable, but inside me a flame caught fire. I would not be erased. The first step in my revenge began with a single quiet phone call. The phone call was to an old friend, Detective Raymond Holt, retired, but still sharp as a blade. We'd known each other since high school, back when he carried my books to class and teased me about always correcting teachers. He answered on the third ring, his voice steady. "Curious Eleanor Lord, I haven't heard from you in years. What's this about papers being signed without your knowledge?" I explained everything, my trembling voice, turning stronger as I laid out the forged signatures, the disappearance of rent checks, the smug dinner table confession. He didn't interrupt, didn't sigh, didn't dismiss me like others had. He listened. When I finished, there was silence on the line. Finally, he said, "If you're telling me your kids forged documents to take your land, that's criminal. But you need more than suspicion. You need proof." That word proof echoed in my head like church bells. Proof was what I would hunt day and night until there was no denying what they had done. I began in the attic, pulling down boxes covered in dust, the air thick and musty, shoeboxes full of old receipts, contracts, property tax statements. I lined them up on my kitchen table, circling signatures, marking dates, comparing the confident loops of my real handwriting to the awkward imitations on the forged documents James's notes scrawled in the margins years ago, helped me connect dots I might have missed. His handwriting was firm, his details exact. Replaced porch railing tenant, Mrs. Gaines, satisfied, one note said. Another rent received on time, deposited into Eleanor's account. Piece by piece, his meticulous records whispered truth into my ear. The more I uncovered, the clearer their scheme became. Charles had rerouted rental checks into a new account. Lydia had pulled her cousin into the scam. To notarize backdated documents, Miriam had delivered papers under false pretenses. And Daniel, me, quiet one, had stayed silent. Silence can be just as damning as action. I wanted to storm into their homes, slap the evidence on the table and scream until their smugness cracked. But Holt's advice echoed in my ears. Don't let them know you're on to them. The minute they suspect, they'll bury the trail. So I played my part. I let Charles brag about his new investments. I let Lydia offer decorating tips for my house as though she already owned it. I let Miriam bring groceries with that sweet smile as though charity could erase betrayal. All the while, I gathered evidence. I even swallowed my pride and asked my neighbor's teenage grandson Marcus to teach me how to use digital tools. He sat with me at my kitchen table, clicking and tapping, showing me how to scan documents, how to organize them, how to build a timeline on a screen. He looked at me with wide eyes, one afternoon shaking his head. "Miss Eleanor, this is like some Netflix show. They really did you dirty?" "Yes," I whispered, staring at the screen, "and they're going to regret it." The power my children wielded in those early months was staggering. Charles strutted around Savannah like a king. Chest puffed his new boots, clicking loud on the church floor. He hosted backyard barbecues, invited half the neighborhood, and bragged about managing Mama's estate as though he were some tycoon. Lydia posted photos online of shopping trips in Atlanta, her hand resting on a designer handbag tagged with smug little captions, "Hard work pays off," and Miriam, my sweet baby girl, played her role best of all. She volunteered at church bake sales, smiled wide as she handed out slices of pecan pie, and whispered about how she was caring for Mama now that she's not so steady anymore. She had the congregation wrapped around her finger, painting herself as the dutiful daughter while she picked my bones clean. Meanwhile, my reputation crumbled. Folks who once came to me for advice now avoided my porch. Neighbors whispered, "Poor Miss Eleanor, she's slipping." Thank God her kids are handling things. The humiliation was suffocating. It was like my life had been rewritten, and I was nothing but a confused old woman in their story. But humiliation, I learned, can sharpen into steel. One Sunday after the preacher gave his sermon, I walked slow out of the church, my cane clicking on the stone steps. I felt every eye on me, not with respect, but with pity, and it burned hotter than fire. As I walked home beneath the oak trees, draped in Spanish moss, I swore to myself, I will not die a penniless old woman whose children rewrote her legacy. I will not let them turn my name into a cautionary tale. That night I sat in my rocking chair clutching a photo of James. The frame was worn, the glass smudged with fingerprints. I whispered into the silence, "I'll make them pay. James'll take everything back. They won't see me coming." The turning point came a week later when Detective Holt introduced me to an attorney named Sandra Reyes. Sandra was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and fierce, with a voice that cut through nonsense like a knife. She specialized in elder fraud cases, though she admitted most never made it far because families preferred to sweep them under the rug. When I spread my papers across her polished mahogany desk, her expression darkened. She flipped through forged deeds, bank records, Lydia's, cousins' notary stamps. Her jaw tightened. "Mrs. Johnson, this isn't just forgery. This is conspiracy. Multiple actors working together to defraud you. They could face serious criminal charges." The words sent a shiver down my spine. My children are my flesh and blood. In orange jumpsuits behind bars, I didn't know whether to cry or smile. Sandra placed a hand over mine. "But Eleanor, this won't be easy. They'll fight dirty. They'll try to paint you as senile, confused, unreliable." "Are you ready for that?" I lifted my chin. Meeting her gaze, I buried a husband, raised 3 children on my own, worked double shifts to keep a roof over our heads. I've been underestimated my whole life. I can take it. From that moment on, the war began. We filed motions, demanded discovery, subpoenaed records. Sandra was relentless, and I shadowed her like a soldier in training. I learned more about the legal system at 74 than I had in all my years combined. Every hearing was a battlefield, every document a weapon. At first, my children laughed it off. Charles smirked from across the courtroom arms, folded like he was at a comedy show. Lydia leaned over to whisper sharp little barbs loud enough for me to hear. Bless her heart, she doesn't even know what day it is. Miriam kept her eyes down, feigning guilt, but her lips twitched like she wanted to smile. But the more evidence we laid out, the tighter their expressions grew. The first crack came the day we presented the notarized deeds with Lydia's cousins. Name glaring back at them, the judge's eyebrows shot up. Charles' smile faltered. Lydia's nails tapped against the table faster and faster. For the first time I saw fear in their eyes, and that fear fed me. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. They had money connections, public sympathy. They would fight like cornered animals. I needed more than documents. I needed something unshakable. So I started recording every phone call, every visit, every slip of the tongue. I captured it all. Marcus Sweetboy had installed an app on my phone. "Just press here, Miss Eleanor," he said, showing me how to start and stop with a single tap. Nobody'll know. One evening, Miriam came by with a grocery bag, smiling wide, her voice dripping with sugar. "Mama, you really shouldn't drag this out. It's making you look, crazy." I forced my voice steady. "Why'd you have me sign those papers, Miriam? You told me they were for estate planning." Her tone slipped sharp and impatient. "Because you never would have done it otherwise. We had to make it happen. It's for your own good." I tapped the button in my pocket. Later, when Sandra played the recording in her office, she nearly leapt out of her chair. "This is direct admission. Eleanor, do you understand what you've done? This isn't just suspicion anymore. This is proof." Meanwhile, Charles strutted around like he was untouchable, driving his shiny new truck, hosting bigger barbecues, throwing cash around like water. But I noticed his smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. And when our gazes met across the courtroom one morning, I saw the first flicker of doubt. In his face, the war heated up. Their lawyers, expensive men from Atlanta in press suits, fought dirty. They filed motions to dismiss, tried to block evidence, painted me as incompetent. One even had the nerve to suggest I undergo a mental competency evaluation. I sat there back straight, cane resting against the bench, staring at him until he looked away. Sandra shredded his argument with precision. "Mrs. Johnson is sharp articulate and has decades of documented management over her estate. The only people acting irrationally are her children. The escalation spilled into family life, too. One night, my youngest son Daniel called me. His voice was soft, hesitant. 'Mom, I didn't sign anything.' I stayed out of it. I wanted to believe him. But silence in betrayal is just another form of complicity." "Then why didn't you stop them?" I asked. He hesitated. "Because they said you wouldn't understand, that you were too old, and I didn't want to lose them." My heart cracked. "And what about losing me, Daniel?" He had no answer. I hung up with tears burning my eyes. But if they thought that would break me, they didn't know the woman who raised them. The next move was mine. I decided to bring out my secret weapon, the battered metal box hidden under the floorboards of James's workshop. I hadn't touched it in years. The box was dented, rusted at the edges, heavy in my arms as I pulled it free. When I pried it open, dust rising into the air, I felt like I was holding a torch in the middle of darkness. Inside were James's journals, every rental agreement, every conversation with tenants, every repair. He had written them down in his steady, meticulous handwriting, receipts taped to pages, notarized notes, even Polaroids of him standing beside tenants on the day they signed leases. It wasn't just history, it was evidence. I spent nights at the kitchen table, glasses sliding down my nose, hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the power of what I held. Piece by piece, I was rebuilding the fortress they thought they had stolen from me. When Sandra saw the box, her eyes lit up. "Eleanor, this is gold. It shows a clear, continuous record of your ownership. This will obliterate their claim that you willingly handed everything over." We decided to keep it hidden until the perfect moment. The morning of the hearing, I carried that box into the courtroom myself, my cane in one hand, the box in the other, my back straight as a soldier. Every eye followed me as I set it down with a heavy thud. Charles shifted in his seat. Lydia leaned close to whisper, her lips pressed tight. Miriam stared at her lap. Sandra stood tall. "Your Honor, what we have here is 30 years of documented evidence of Mrs. Johnson's management of her estate. Handwritten journals, signed receipts, notarized notes, all predating any alleged transfer. We submit these as exhibits." The judge's eyebrows shot up, the defense attorney sputtered, and Charles' face went pale. For the first time in months, the power shifted, but I knew the battle wasn't done. I still had one card left to play, something so damning, so irrefutable, that when it came to light, their entire dynasty would collapse. And it was waiting for me in the bottom drawer of my dresser, a letter from James, sealed for nearly 20 years, marked with only 2 words, "For Eleanor." The envelope had been waiting for me for nearly 20 years, tucked in the bottom drawer of my dresser. Its edges were yellowed, the paper soft with age, and across the front, in James's steady script, were 2 words that made my breath catch. For Eleanor, I had never opened it. Grief had swallowed me whole when James died, and I couldn't bear the thought of his words locked inside paper when I still longed to hear his voice in the air. But that night, as the courthouse battle swirled through my head, I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp casting long shadows, and I knew it was time. With trembling fingers, I slit the envelope open. The handwriting inside was bold, deliberate, every stroke filled with the weight of a man who knew what was coming. If you are reading this, Ellie, it means I am gone, but I want to make something clear, so there is no doubt. This land, this house, these properties, we built them together, and they belong to you, not the children, not the bank, not anyone else. I filed my will with Judge Hollis himself, and a notarized copy will remain sealed in the courthouse archives. If anyone ever tries to take this from you, fight them. This is your legacy. Protect it. I pressed the letter to my chest. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, tears spilling down my cheeks. But behind the grief was fire. James had seen this coming. He had trusted me to carry the torch. The next morning I walked into Sandra's office with the letter. She read it once, then again, then looked up at me with fire blazing in her eyes. Eleanor, this isn't just a letter. This is testimony. If Judge Hollis still has that will on record, this isn't just evidence, it's a bullet. That afternoon, we marched straight to the courthouse records office. The young clerk behind the desk blinked nervously as Sandra requested the file. That's sealed, he muttered. Sandra Slid, Judge Hollis. Written authorization across the counter. The boy swallowed hard, scurried away, and returned minutes later with a thick envelope stamped and sealed. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was James's notarized will. It matched the letter word for word. Everything to Eleanor Johnson for life, with inheritance provisions only upon her natural passing. Sandra let out a slow breath. We've got them. The next hearing felt like Judgment Day. Sandra entered the courtroom with the sealed will in her briefcase. I followed, clutching James's letter in my purse. When she rose to speak, her voice rang out like thunder. Your Honor, this is the notarized will of the late James Johnson, witnessed and filed by Judge Hollis himself. It clearly states that all property and accounts remain with Mrs. Johnson until her passing. Any transfer of ownership prior to that is invalid, and any signatures suggesting otherwise are fraudulent. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorneys fumbled with their papers, their voices rising in frantic objection. Charla's face went slack. Lydia's lips pressed into a thin white line. Miriam's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel against the desk. Thoughtfully, Mr. Johnson's will is clear. Unless the plaintiffs can provide stronger legal evidence, I am inclined to view these transfers as fraudulent. That word, fraudulent, echoed through the room like a thunderclap. Charles leapt to his feet, voice trembling with rage. This is manipulation. Mama doesn't even remember signing those papers. She's confused. She doesn't know what she is talking about. I rose slowly, cane in hand, and turned to face him. My voice carried steady and clear. I remember every word your father wrote to me. I remember every nail he hammered into those walls, every dollar we saved, every tenant we helped. What I don't remember is raising a son who would sell his own mother for $1. The courtroom went silent. Charla's face flushed red as he sank back into his seat. But the battle wasn't over. Their lawyers fought like rabid dogs, filing motion after motion, dragging proceedings out. Some nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had the strength to keep going. But each time doubt crept in, I heard James's voice in my head. Protect it. Fight them. So I did. We gathered more proof. I met with tenants who had rented from me for decades, asking them to sign affidavits, swearing in not my children, collected rent, maintained the homes, and signed agreements. Marcus helped me digitize it, all affidavits, photos, receipts, organizing them into folders that told the story like a crime novel. Then came the breaking point. One of Lydia's cousins, the notary who had stamped those forged documents, was called to the stand. Under oath, her hands shook, her voice cracking. I just did what Lydia asked me to. She said it was family business. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lydia shot her cousin a glare so sharp it could have cut glass. Sandra stepped forward. "So you admit you notarized documents without Mrs. Johnson present?" The cousin nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes." It was the crack that shattered the entire wall. The judge slammed his gavel. "I have heard enough. These documents were forged. Property ownership remains with Mrs. Johnson, as her husband's will, and decades of evidence demonstrate. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." My hands trembled, not with fear, but with victory. Charles looked like a man watching his kingdom burn. Miriam buried her face in her hands. Lydia, ever the viper, leaned toward me as court adjourned, hissing through clenched teeth. "You'll regret this, old woman." But I only smiled, steady as stone. "No, darling, you will." The fallout was swift. Word spread through Savannah like wildfire. The whispers that once painted me as senile now turned against them. Neighbors shook their heads, disgusted. Church members, who once avoided me now, crossed pews to squeeze my hand. My children hadn't just lost, they had been exposed, but my revenge wasn't complete. No, I wanted them stripped of their illusions. I wanted them disgraced, their names dragged in the dirt, so the whole community could see them the way I saw them that night, at the dining table, smug, greedy, heartless. I hadn't just won the legal battle, I was about to end their dynasty once and for all, and the first step was telling my story to the world. The opportunity came when Savannah's local paper called me directly. Word of the case had spread fast. The whispers, the court battles, the sight of a 74-year-old woman dragging her children to court had stirred curiosity like bees in a hive. The editor, a man named Douglas Price, spoke with a voice full of polite urgency. "Mrs. Johnson folks around here are dying to know the truth. Would you be willing to share your story?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, "but I won't just talk. I'll show you." When Douglas came to my farmhouse, I laid everything out on the dining table where the betrayal had begun. The forged deeds, the bank records, the notarized lies, even the recording of Miriam admitting she tricked me. Then I placed James' letter in front of him. The heart of it all, he sat there wide-eyed, his pen frozen above his notepad. This is unbelievable. It's not just a story, it's a scandal." 2 days later, the headline stretched across the Savannah Morning News Matriarch at 74 defeats children in landmark fraud case. The article painted them exactly as they were: manipulators, thieves, liars. It quoted my words about legacy, about betrayal, about resilience. It printed James' letter in full. By sundown, everyone in Savannah was talking. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in months knocked on my door with casseroles and peach cobblers, pressing my hand, whispering, "Good for you, Eleanor." You showed them church ladies who once avoided my pew, now sat beside me, heads held high, glaring at Miriam across the aisle. And my children, they couldn't escape it. Charles stormed through town, red-faced, barking at anyone who dared mention the article. His boss at the dealership called him in the next morning and told him to clear out his desk. "We can't have this kind of reputation tied to our business," they said. Miriam's church friends, once loyal, now crossed the street to avoid her. She had been the face of devoted daughterhood, but after the paper exposed her deception, whispers of snake and liar followed her like shadows. And Lydia, her online, world crumbled. She deleted her accounts, but not before people screenshotted every photo of her flaunting jewelry and handbags bought with stolen money. Local boutiques quietly stopped serving her. At one restaurant, I heard she was asked to leave after a woman muttered, "We don't serve thieves here," but it still wasn't enough. The district attorney formally announced charges: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The press swarmed cameras, flashing microphones shoved into faces, and I made sure to be there sitting in the front. Row cane, across my lap, head held high. The reporters asked question after question. "Mrs. Johnson, how do you feel about pressing charges against your own children?" I looked straight into the camera. Blood may be thicker than water, but truth is stronger than both. My children betrayed me, and I will not let them betray the legacy of those who came before me." Charles shoved past reporters, snarling. No comment, but not before cameras caught every angry line in his face. Miriam wept behind her lawyer, hiding like a child. Lydia, bold as ever, tried to smile for the cameras, but her smile looked cracked brittle like porcelain about to shatter. Their dynasty was collapsing. Charles lost his job. Miriam's church turned its back. Lydia's name was poison. But I wasn't done. I wanted to strip them of every ill-gotten gain to make sure the very things they had flaunted became symbols of their downfall. With Sandra's help, I clawed back everything. Charles' new truck, bought with my stolen money, was seized under a lien. Miriam's investment furniture, purchased on my account, was repossessed. Lydia's jewelry, the gold bracelet she flashed at every barbecue, the necklace she wore to church like a crown, was traced back to stolen funds and confiscated, and then I arranged something that sent a chill through Savannah. A public auction, not for my land, not for the legacy I fought to protect. No, this auction was for their luxuries, their trophies, the very things they had stolen from me to parade around as proof of their success. On a bright Saturday morning under the hot Georgia sun, the courthouse square filled with neighbors and strangers alike. A podium stood tall, a gavel ready to strike. I stood at the center, cane in one hand, microphone in the other. "These items," I said, my voice ringing out across the crowd, "were bought with betrayal. They were taken from me under lies, under fraud. Today justice takes them back," the auctioneer began. "The truck went first, sold to a farmer who needed it for work. The bracelet, the necklace, the furniture all gone within an hour, snatched up by eager bidders." The crowd clapped, some even cheered, and standing at the edge, Charles watched red-faced fists clenched as strangers drove away with his truck. Miriam sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. Lydia turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking like gunshots on pavement. I felt no pity, because for months they had stripped me of dignity, reputation, and peace. Now it was their turn to taste humiliation. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Charles moved into a dingy apartment, his pride-crushed whispers of fraudster trailing him wherever he went. Miriam withdrew from church altogether. Her once sweet voice silenced her friends. Gone. And Lydia last, I heard, she was trying to sell cheap trinkets online, her glamorous facade shattered. The dynasty they thought they were building was rubble, and me I rebuilt. Tenants returned, neighbors trusted me again, and the land my grandmother fought for stood firm beneath my feet. I planted roses in the front yard, their blooms defiant against the summer heat. One night months later, I sat in my rocking chair, James' letter on my lap. The crickets sang, the moonlight spilled silver across the porch, and I whispered, "It's done. James, I ended them." And with that, I realized something chilling. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, slow, steady, relentless, until the ones who betrayed you are nothing more than shadows of their former selves. I rocked back and forth, a smile curving my lips, and let the silence settle, because the dynasty was gone, and I was still here. The criminal case picked up like a summer storm over the Savannah. River first, a murmur, then a black wall of thunder rolling toward us so fast you felt it in your bones before the rain even hit. The Chatham County District Attorney filed indictments in late September, and I stood outside the Tomochichi Federal Building and U.S. Courthouse with my cane planted like a staff, the magnolia leaves rattling above us as the press tried to make a circle around my small frame. I said little. I had learned that the more I spoke, the more my children borrowed my words and twisted them like wire. I let evidence talk now. Evidence didn't stutter, and it didn't cry. Arraignment day came with bleary dawn light. River Street was still damp from overnight mist, and the smell of coffee drifted up from a cart parked near Wright Square. I was early habit, I suppose, for a life lived watching the mail, the tenants, the calendar. You learn to get to places before the doors are unlocked. Sandra met me at the courthouse steps, crisp suit, hair coiled back, eyes. "Careful, we keep our faces neutral," she murmured, looping her arm through mine and our spines stiff. I nodded. I'd been doing that since the first forged deed. They brought them in, one by one. Charles in a navy jacket that couldn't hide the sweat seeping at the collar, Miriam with eyes puffy from a night that had stolen more than sleep. And Lydia, well, she walked like a blade, chin-pointed mouth, ironed thin heels, ticking on stone as if to carve her initials there. I watched her stare past me, pretending I was part of the architecture. It occurred to me then that I had changed for her, become furniture to be moved and catalogued a relic. That thought might have crushed me once. Today, it only steadied my hand on the cane, State of Georgia versus Charles Johnson, Miriam Johnson, and Lydia Turner. The clerk read voice, bouncing off old wood. The judge's stern, deliberate asked for their pleas. Not guilty, they said, in a chorus, starched by counsel. The DA outlined the counts fraud, forgery, conspiracy, financial exploitation of an elderly person. My cheeks warmed at that last phrase. It felt like a brand and a shield. At the same time, I didn't feel elderly. I felt sharpened. Discovery churned like a river in flood. The DA's team set up in a low-tan building near the courthouse and stacked boxes with names that belonged to Mimi Properties. My accounts, my years, now printed in black marker, Sandra and I sifted. We built timelines that ran from the night James and I painted our first front door to the morning Lydia convinced a notary cousin to stamp a lie. We traced money routing like ants through sugar, following little glittery pieces to a truck note, a bracelet receipt, a boutique ledger in Buckhead that had copied Lydia's driver's license at purchase, because it was policy. Policy, I learned, can be a righteous friend. The DA called me in for a pre-trial interview. He was a careful man with a slow drawl that could lull you if you weren't paying attention, Mrs. Johnson. The statute gives us teeth on financial exploitation, he explained, tapping a paper with his pen. But juries are human. Families complicate humans. We'll need your steadiness. We'll need your clarity. His eyes softened. We'll need your courage. I swallowed and looked at the recorders. Red dot. They say blood is thicker, I told him, but a forged signature is heavier. It sits on your chest at night and tells you to stop breathing. I won't. The court reporter looked up, then held my gaze a second, and in that tiny nod I found a plank to stand on. Subpoenas went out like seeds from a fist neighbor's banker's tenants. The cousin notary, the UPS clerk who remembered a pickup with a Parcels Plus envelope fat with documents. People began to emerge from the hush that had blanketed the neighborhood when the case started. A tenant who remembered Charles changing a mailbox lock, a church acquaintance who recalled Lydia boasting about streamlining my portfolio, a back-office bank employee who flagged irregular logins from Lydia's phone. The circle was closing, and I felt it in the way Charles stopped looking me in the eye, in hallways, and started looking at his shoes. But power does not go quietly. It flails. The first flail was small and mean. Someone slid a note under my front door one night. Grandma, drop it or fall. The handwriting leaned right, juvenile and angry. I stared at it under the kitchen lamp, the yellow paper almost obscene on my table. I set the kettle back on the stove without making tea and called Sandra. Document it. She said, voice clipped, and well, log it with the DA. When I hung up, I put the note in a Ziploc and tucked it next to James's letter in my drawer. The proximity felt right love letter, threat letter, legacy, warning. A week later, the tires on my old Buick crunched weird when I backed out. I stopped, got out, and crouched. 2 of them had been knifed. The rubber lips were raggeder than my patience. I phoned the police, then sat on the porch with my cane across my knees, watching the street as morning burned into noon. Spanish moss shivered in a breeze that didn't touch my skin. Marcus wandered up the steps carrying a box of donuts. He saw the car, then my face, and didn't say a word. He sat beside me, and together we bit into sugar rings and watched the world behave the way it always did, delivery trucks grumbling, kids on bikes cackling, a dog ripping after a squirrel, and it calmed me. Savannah kept being Savannah. There's power in that, too. Trial date late November. Jury selection, the long dance. I wore the same dark blue dress I'd worn to James's funeral, because I'd learned you can carry a good man's weight without sinking if you pick the right cloth. The veneer filed in faces a patchwork of the city contractors with sunburnt noses, a retired schoolteacher who asked 3 good questions, a young woman with braids who kept tapping her foot in time with her thoughts. The defense used strikes on anyone who'd nodded when the DA mentioned elder fraud. They wanted blank slates, or better yet, slates hungry to believe in the myth of misunderstanding. But lies leave fingerprints, and I was ready to point them out. Opening statements, the DA put photos, a line of Polaroids of me and tenants, the journals from the battered box, a copy of James's will projected large against cream plaster. This is a simple story dressed in complicated paperwork. He said, a mother built and her children took. We will show you how. Then it was the defense's turn, and they took a tone I recognized from PTA meetings and car dealerships. A mother confused, children concerned, papers signed in love, misunderstood by lawyers. He gestured at me like I was both delicate and dangerous. I kept my eyes on the flag in the corner and thought of my grandmother saying, hold land with both hands. They called me first, swear in, sit down, breath steady. The DA guided me through my life, like stepping stones, the first rental in Carver Village, the second on 38th Street, the third out by Skidaway Road. He held the journals tender like scripture as we entered them into evidence. He asked about the forged notices to redirect rent and about that dinner where Charles took the head chair in my house. When I repeated his words, you gave it to us. It's all legal, a sound went through the jurors like a wheel catching a rut. People know hubris when they hear it. It's got a flavor like pennies, cross-examination. The defense tried to pick me apart, like threads from a hem. Mrs. Johnson, do you remember what you had for breakfast on March 3rd 2 years ago? The taller one smirked. I looked at him for a long second and said, no, sir, but I remember the day my name left my life and took my money with it. His mouth pinched. He pivoted, tried pity. Isn't it true? You're 74 and sometimes forgetful. I held his gaze and thought of my slashed tires, my porch, my steady heart. It's true. I am 74. I said, it's not true. I forget who I am. He learned then what many have. There are answers that don't fit into the boxes you draw. They called the cousin notary next. She came in with hair frizzed from the humidity and nerves. Sandra had told me to watch her hands. They tremble in truth. They did under the DA's question, she admitted in a voice that sounded small, even with a microphone that she had notarized papers, without me present. Family pressure. She whispered Lydia said it was fine. The defense tried to rehabilitate her with talk of holidays and casseroles, as if mac and cheese could erase a stamp. It didn't. Then the bank tech, the one who traced login metadata. He spoke about IP, addresses and device IDs, things I'd only learned because Marcus made me a student of the 21st century. On a screen, the logins plotted like constellations, and there was Lydia's phone pinging from her house at the exact times money-hopped accounts. The jury leaned forward and took that in the way you take in a tide chart before a fishing trip. Facts you can plan your day around. In between court days, I slept light. Sometimes I'd wake to the distant horn of a ship sliding upriver to the port, and I'd count off the beats until the sound faded. Loneliness can be measured in counts like that, but so can endurance. On a Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I stood in Forsyth Park under the live oaks, watching dogs loop and children scream like joy was a kind of wind. A woman about my age approached with a container in her hands. I made too much gumbo, she said, thrusting it forward. I'm nobody to you, but I'm somebody to a mother who gave too much to her kids. Take it I did. Back home, I spooned gumbo into a bowl, and every shrimp felt like a blessing, set over a second life. By the second week, something shifted. You can feel when a trial changes temperature. The defense grew brittle. Their private whispers wore sharper edges. Charles' knee bounced. Miriam stared at her hands like they were maps of a world she didn't want to read. Lydia, she adopted a stillness that seemed expensive. Her eyes were black coin slots. They took their shot at character witnesses. An old neighbor said Charles had always mowed her grass in the summers. The defense lawyer smiled like a man stepping into sunshine, uncrossed the D. A asked, "Did Charles ever mow without being paid?" She blinked. "Well, no. Did he ever mow Mrs. Johnson's, the person whose land paid for his gas?" She looked at me, then down. "No. A small thing, but small things add up. It's how roofs get built and banks get emptied." The DA ended our case in chief with James' will and the sealed archive record from the courthouse. They zoomed in on the judge's notarization from years ago, and an involuntary gasp escaped me. That day returned in a rush. James standing a little too straight, because pride will hold a man upright when pain tries to take his knees, the way he'd squeezed my hand as we signed life into the future. I wiped my cheek. The jurors watched that too. On the defense side, the strategy rattled. They pivoted to miscommunication, to estate planning intentions lost in translation, to a loving family, trying to protect an aging parent from the complexity of modern property management. The words felt like wet envelopes. You can feel the glue, but nothing sticks. A graph of my bank account stuttered on the screen. The defense asked me on recross whether I'd perhaps authorized Charles informally. "I never authorized anyone to go behind me," I said. "If I put my keys in your pocket, don't tell me you own my car." Some evenings after court, Daniel would text, just 3 words. "I'm so sorry." It landed in my palm like a leaf light, repeatable, not heavy enough to mulch guilt. I wanted to type back fury or mercy or something in between, but I left the messages unread. Silence this time was my ally. We were on the brink of closings when a rumor slid through the courthouse halls like thin smoke. Lydia was talking to the DA. I didn't believe it at first. She had built an identity from granite and glamour. But that afternoon, the DA asked Sandra and me to step into a side room. Lydia sat at the end of a table, hands folded, eyes bright in a way I had never seen. People brighten when they see exit signs. Her lawyer did the speaking. "Miss Turner is prepared to accept responsibility in exchange for a reduced charge and testify as to the roles of Charles and Miriam in the scheme." The room hummed with fluorescent buzz and breathing. I stared at the woman who had rolled her eyes at my curtains and snickered at my church shoes and slid herself into the center of my family. For a second, I saw a picture of her as a girl, hungry for something shiny that would quiet whatever roared inside her. Then the picture dissolved. Choices are not hunger. Choices are cut by knives. We pick up ourselves. The DA turned to unusual, perhaps, but this was my life. "Mrs. Johnson, your input will matter." He said this could lock in convictions. My breath moved slow. Could I bear the woman who orchestrated my humiliation, walking out earlier than the son who smirked across my table? Mercy is a blade with 2 edges. One edge cuts the rope that bound you, the other slices the wrist that tied the knot. Sandra's fingers touched my sleeve once. A pulse of solidarity. We decide with the land in mind. She whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. With legacy, I nodded tiny. "If she tells the truth," I said, looking at Lydia, "the whole truth. No makeup, no mirrors." Lydia held my eyes for the first time in months. "Yes," she said, and the words shivered out like glass. Her proffer came 2 days later in a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers and old coffee. She talked for 3 hours about the first time Charles floated the idea of bringing the portfolio into the next decade, about Miriam's soft touch with me, about how the cousin notary got dragged in, about the backdating, the rent redirection, the passwords guessed from birthdays and dogs' names. Names were names, dates were dates. Money hopped like money does when it thinks. No one's looking. People think secrecy is shadows, but secrecy is fluorescent, ugly and bright. Once you flip the switch, the jury never heard the proffer, only her later testimony. But I heard it, and in hearing it, a tired place in me grew fierce again. Rage is not a home, but it is a match, and sometimes you need fire to see the map. Closing arguments arrived like trains on the minute. The DA spoke first, a Welsh of facts and story. A mother built, the children took, they forged, they hid, she fought. The law recognized her now, you must. He pointed not at me, but at James' journals. "You can still smell the ink," he said softly. And I watched 2 jurors glance at the boxes like they could. The defense tried to conjure doubt where there was only regret. "Isn't this all just messy family business?" he asked. "A story of good intentions and bad paperwork." I thought of the slashed tires, the note, the laughter at my table. I thought of the way Miriam had said, "for your own good," like a lullaby sharpened to a spike. The judge's charge was precise. Then the jurors filed out with their notebooks and their quiet stares, and the courtroom breathed the way buildings breathe at night, deep and slow and endless. We waited. Waiting is its own litigation. Your back argues with your chair. Your heart argues with your head. Your fear argues with your faith. I walked the hall once, twice, cane clicking like a metronome for a song. Only I could hear. Through the window I could see the cathedral spires slicing a wet gray sky. Tourists carried paper cups and maps. A child in a red raincoat stomped a puddle as if a verdict could be made from splash. 2 hours, 3. At the 4th, the bailiff appeared and spoke into the judge's ear. The doors opened and we slid into our places as if we were notes in someone else's chord. The jury filed in, faces readable. The foreperson clutched a stack of papers. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor." The woman's voice was steady-trained, perhaps by years of telling rooms of people to sit up straight. She passed the forms. The judge read, then handed them to the clerk. The clerk cleared his throat, and every bone in my body lit with that one flicker between candle and flame. On the count of fraud against Charles Johnson, I closed my eyes and thought of James's letter breathing in the drawer beside my socks. I thought of my grandmother's hands pushing seed into dirt that didn't want it, and how roots are stubborn even in drought. The clerk inhaled to speak, and I felt a presence at my shoulder. I opened my eyes. Lydia stood in the aisle, pale lips parted. In her hand was a small envelope bulging dense as a sin, and in her other a cheap black phone with no case and no history. She looked at me like a woman staring over a cliff edge at a sea that remembers every body it ever held. "I need to tell you something before they say it," she whispered. The clerk's voice rose over hers, and I turned toward him as the first word fell, while Lydia pressed the envelope into my palm, heavy enough to change everything. "Guilty." The word rang out so sharp and final that for a moment I didn't feel the envelope in my palm, didn't feel the courtroom's air thicken, didn't even feel the cane beneath my hand. It was as if the whole world had narrowed into that single syllable, a stone dropped in still water rippling outward until it shook the foundation of everything my children thought they owned. On the count of forgery against Charles Johnson, guilty. On the count of conspiracy against Charles Johnson, guilty. I sat frozen, the wood of the bench pressing into my back, listening as each count was read. My son, my eldest, guilty. On all Miriam next. On the count of fraud against Miriam Johnson, guilty. On the count of conspiracy, guilty. Her shoulders buckled as if the word itself weighed 100 pounds. She wept openly, her sobs echoing across the chamber. I remembered her braiding my hair when I couldn't lift my arms, singing hymns in the kitchen with that sweet voice of hers. Now the hymns had dried, replaced by courtroom tears that no longer touched me. And then Lydia. On the count of fraud against Lydia. Turner, guilty. On the count of forgery, guilty. On the count of conspiracy, guilty. She did not cry. She did not break. She sat straight-backed, eyes forward, lips tight, as if she could still conjure dignity from the ashes. Yet her hand lingered on the armrest, pale knuckles trembling ever so slightly. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them, then looked at the defendants with eyes that carried no softness. You stole from your own blood. You mocked the values this community was built upon. The law will hold you accountable. The gavel fell, and still the envelope burned in my palm. Back home that night, I placed the envelope on the table under the lamp. Its paper was cheap rough, beneath my fingers, sealed tight with tape instead of glue. I hesitated before opening it, because in my bones I knew whatever Lydia had slipped into my hand was not mercy. It was leverage. It was the kind of thing snakes leave behind when their skin splits open. I peeled the tape, slid the papers free. Inside were photocopies, dozens of them, bank slips, ledger pages, signed authorizations, and tucked in the middle, one handwritten letter in Lydia's sharp-slanted script. Eleanor, they were going to leave me holding the blame. Charles said if it went south, he'd tell everyone I orchestrated it. Miriam agreed. I couldn't let them bury me alone. I've given you what you need. You'll know what to do. I sat back, the air catching in my throat. Proof that not only had they betrayed me, they had betrayed each other. My children had planned to sacrifice Lydia to paint her as the mastermind while they walked away free. I laughed, then a sound I hadn't heard from my own lips in months. Bitter, sharp but alive, betrayal eating betrayal. It was almost poetic. I placed the envelope beside James's letter in the drawer. Side by side, love and treachery, legacy and ruin. Two anchors in a storm that was finally calming. The sentencing came weeks later on a cold January morning when frost clung to the oak branches and the air tasted of iron. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, church members, reporters, everyone wanted to see the end. The judge read each sentence slow and clear. Charles, 5 years in prison. Restitution required Miriam 3 years probation to follow Lydia, 2 years reduced for cooperation. Though the restitution nearly drowned her, gasps filled the room. Some folks muttered, some crossed themselves, some just shook their heads. I sat still, my cane across my lap, my eyes never leaving the bench. When it was over, Charles turned to me, his eyes wild, his mouth twisted with rage. "This is your fault, Mama, you ruined us." I met his gaze steady as stone. "No, son, you ruined yourselves." Miriam couldn't even look at me. She shuffled out of the courtroom in chains, her tears falling onto the polished floor. Lydia, though, paused. For the first time, she looked like a woman stripped bare. No makeup, no polish, just hollow eyes and a face that had lost its armor. She whispered, barely audible, "I told you the truth. Remember that I said nothing. Some truths don't deserve acknowledgement." Life after the trial felt strange. Quiet. The neighbors' whispers softened, replaced by nods of respect. Tenants returned with rent checks addressed to me again. Church ladies pressed pies into my hands without words, their eyes saying enough, yet silence has weight. The farmhouse, though still standing strong, carried an echo. At night, I sat in my rocking chair, the creak of wood filling the dark. Sometimes I thought I heard James laugh in the kitchen or Miriam singing from years ago. Ghosts of love and betrayal tangled together. I tended my roses out front, trimmed hedges patched the porch, where the wood had warped. Every nail hammered was an act of reclamation. Every bloom that opened was proof the land still thrived, no matter how they had tried to kill it. But the dynasty they dreamed of, the empire of greed they thought they'd inherit, it was gone. And I remained. One night, months later, I walked to the back field where the soil was richest. I stood beneath the moonlight, the grass cool under my shoes, and I whispered into the night, "It's done, James." I ended them. The air was still save for the hum of crickets. And in that stillness I realized something chilling. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits in letters and journals and roots buried deep. Sometimes it takes 74 years and a lifetime of patience, but when it comes, it carves dynasties into dust. I turned back toward the house, the porch light glowing warm against the dark, and smiled, because the dynasty was gone and I was still here. The end.